Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about some more inconsistencies and plot holes in the X-Men movies, and I will also try to come up with theories and excuses to explain away this problem, and I'm doing this mostly for fun because I enjoy talking about stuff like that, so this is not meant to defend the Dark Phoenix movie, which I think is terrible, but this is simply just for fun. So the problem is the character ages. If we look at the timeline of the X-Men movies, their ages don't really make much sense. Now we can say all of that is simply because all the actors have been recast, rebooted, and so we're simply kind of not meant to notice that it's supposed to be the same character, simply played by a different actor. But the problem is that Charles and Eric are supposed to be at least 60 years old by the 90s, and so why are they still looking young? So maybe they should have simply put some old makeup on them to make them look a little bit older. Or maybe simply not set this movie in the 90s. If it was set right after Apocalypse back in the 80s, then it would be more plausible. They would only be like around 50 years old. They still look pretty young, but it's not that obvious. It's not such a huge discrepancy. And one way to explain all of this is by saying that mutants are actually aging much slower than humans. It was actually mentioned specifically about Mystique to explain away the fact that she looks so young in those old movies, which were set after 2000. So if she is the same age as Charles, then why is she so young later? So they explain that away in First Class by saying that she actually ages slower. So maybe a lot of mutants have this advantage, but then why did Charles and Eric look so old? So maybe we can explain that with Hank's serum, because remember he used the DNA of Mystique to create a serum to control his own mutation to appear human, and Charles later used the same serum from Hank. That means maybe some of Mystique's DNA also made him age slower than he would have normally. Maybe at some point, which we never saw, maybe someone used that serum on Magneto as well, maybe to disable his powers, but it also gave him longer life. So we can explain it that way. Also, there's a bunch of problems with the ages of the younger X-Men, like Jean and Scott, because we saw flashbacks with a younger CGI'd Patrick Stewart meeting young Scott and meeting young Jean, and he would look like Patrick Stewart, not like McAvoy. So again, we can say, okay, it's simply a change of actors, simply don't notice that. Or maybe we can use the different timeline excuse. Maybe because it's all in a different timeline, maybe things happen differently. Maybe in that original timeline he never took that serum, maybe it only happened in this new timeline, and so he aged slower in the new timeline. And as for those younger guys, maybe they were actually born at different times because, the whole timeline was changed because of all the time traveling. So maybe their parents had sex at a different time, and so they became their own genetic sibling. The same people had children and they named them the same, but they were actually genetically different. But because they are still a genetic sibling of that original version, that explains why they are still so similar and basically the same character, only with a new actor. And it can also be used to explain why they were born at a different time. And so that can explain those changes in their ages. So as for Magneto and Charles and Hank, maybe they all use that serum to age slower, just like Mystique, so that can explain it. Also, we don't really know the exact date that the original X-Men movie was set in. It came out in 2000, but it said that it's in the not too distant future in the movie. So that means it could have been many years later, actually. Now, the problem is that we see the Twin Towers in the first X-Men movie, so that kind of has to put it before 2001, unless we say in that timeline maybe 9/11 never happened. So technically we can simply claim those older movies were much later, and so they had time to grow older like we saw them in those movies. But then we saw young Jean and the movie said it's 20 years before, so that means it couldn't have been too far in the future. Also, even in X-Men Origins we saw Patrick Stewart in the 70s, and he looked like Patrick Stewart. But again, we can use the serum excuse or simply the not notice it's a different actor approach. And as for Magneto, maybe in that original timeline he actually spent many decades in prison because he was never released by Charles and Wolverine, which happened in Days of Future Past thanks to the time traveling. So maybe in the original timeline he was never released from prison until much later. So if he spent decades rotting away in a prison cell, maybe that explains why he aged worse than he would have if he was free. So now that Magneto is free and living a healthy lifestyle, maybe that also can explain why he didn't age as badly as the original Magneto. And also Charles had that experience with Apocalypse, who tried to take him over. So if Apocalypse wanted to turn him into his new host, maybe it also gave Charles better healing. Maybe that also caused him to age slower thanks to Apocalypse. Also he lost his hair thanks to Apocalypse, which begs the question, how did that happen in the original timeline in which they never fought Apocalypse? So why did he lose his hair there? I mean, we saw that Charles has a pretty luscious hair before Apocalypse took it away from him. So what happened in the original timeline? Why did he grow bald? Was it to use Cerebro better? Because there was a comment by Hank that maybe it's better to shave your head. So maybe he was simply shaving his head. And also in Logan we saw that Charles was growing hair in the back of his head, so he wasn't completely bald. So it did seem to be like a male pattern baldness, like a natural baldness. And it was supposed to be set in the new timeline after Apocalypse happened, and in Apocalypse he lost his hair because of that technology device trying to take him over, and it was affecting him from the back of the head. So why does he have hair on the back of his head in Logan when that was the place that should have had the least hair because of what we saw in Apocalypse? So it's also kind of a contradiction. I guess maybe what Apocalypse did to him was kind of temporarily, and so eventually he was able to grow hair in the back of his head again, but decided to shave it off simply to look better up until the time of Logan, in which he was again growing hair from the back of his head. So here's my final theory to summarize. So I think as a result of the time travel in Days of Future Past, some of the younger characters were born earlier than they would have originally, and that explains their age discrepancy. And because of what Apocalypse tried to do to Charles, to try to turn him into a new host, it slowed down his aging. And because Magneto was released from prison and lived a healthy lifestyle and did not spend decades in prison like in the original timeline, that explains why he aged so well, because he's still a mutant and his aging process might also be slightly delayed. And also he was also given some extra powers by Apocalypse in this new timeline, so maybe that also gave him some extra healing factor, because Apocalypse had healing factor, so maybe all the mutants that he tried to enhance also got that benefit of slower aging. And also Storm was enhanced by him, so that also explains Storm. It doesn't explain Angel. We can use the excuse, as I said, that he was born at a different time, so the original Angel was born later, so we can explain it that way. But let me know what you think. If you have any more theories, suggestions, ideas on how to try to explain away these inconsistencies, let me know in the comments and we can discuss it, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.